All right. Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to start settling in. So, welcome back. So, for those of you just joining us, my name is Cody Guitar, Chapter Director for Ashley Chrissy here at Crandall, one of the people who put this event together for y'all. And for those tuned in online, welcome back, or if there's new people, just welcome. So last night we had the opportunity to hear Dr. John Stackhouse discuss why Jesus is the only way. What do Christians mean by that, and why do we believe it? And today he's going to discuss something a little different that's kind of flowing with the theme of the topics that we've been discussing today. And before I get to that, let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Stackhouse. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, Dr. Stackhouse is professor of religious studies here at Crandall University, and he holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from Queen's University at Kingston, a Master of Arts in Church History and Theology from Wheaton College, and a PhD in History and Theology from the University of Chicago. He has discussed Christianity on a variety of media platforms through many media outlets, including on CBC Radio with Michael Enright and Rex Murphy, on Australia's most popular public affairs TV show, and even in the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. He has defended the faith. He's really a global defender of the faith, as I like to call him. He has defended the faith to Mormons in Utah, to communists in Shanghai, to students in New Zealand, and religious leaders in Jerusalem, as well as on university campuses from UNB to UBC in Canada, and from Harvard to Stanford in the United States. And he's the author of over 800 articles, book chapters, and reviews, as well as 10 books with an 11th on the way. As I mentioned last night, that is quite the feat, because most of us won't even read that much in our lifetimes, let alone write it. Now, particular significance for this event, I'll mention again, a number of his publications are on issues directly related to the defense of the Christian faith, such as his books, Can God Be Trusted?, and a manual he wrote on defending the faith entitled Humble Apologetics. And Humble Apologetics is actually used as a textbook not only here at Crandall, but also as far as universities in Oxford and London. And next year, Oxford University Press will be publishing Dr. Stackhouse's latest book, Can You Believe? An Invitation to the Hesitant, which will be a great addition to your apologetics library, which I all know you have. So today, he is going to be discussing the topic of how Christians can respond to deal with pluralism in our present Canadian context. A touchy subject, I know. What should be the Canadian Christian response to pluralism in our own culture and time? And how does it affect the way in which we live out our faith and present it to others? And this is no doubt a hot button issue, like many others these days, that can stir the emotions and send words and even sometimes fists a-flying. However, I can think of few people as suitable as Dr. Stackhouse to speak to this issue both intelligently and tactfully, so as to be in keeping with the call of Scripture, as we just discussed earlier, to deal with these things in an attitude of gentleness and respect. And so, it is my pleasure to once again invite Dr. John Stackhouse to come up and give us something to think about. So, Dr. Stackhouse, welcome.
It's always loud, sometimes clear. I want to make sure that we haven't run. Our projector in this room is quite demanding. If you don't feed it every 5 minutes, it goes into a pouting mode, and it's now being a bit surly, so we'll see if we can get it to reconnect with us here, and then otherwise we'll have to shut down and go back, because it was doing so well until like literally moments ago, right? Is it back now?
Yes.
Yeah. It needs a lot of attention. Now, this would be the topic I discussed last night, and it's such a great lecture, I'd happy to do it again, but, you know, since you're here and I'm here and we've already heard it, let's do this one instead. We're going to talk about sharing the faith in a context of pluralism. Let me try to suggest what I mean by pluralism, and perhaps you've heard definitions all day. That's good. I hope my previous speakers were able to talk about what they meant by this, because the word means different things in different contexts, and you can be for pluralism in one context and against pluralism in another, and completely indifferent to it in a third. So I want to give you three definitions of what I at least mean by pluralism. First, pluralism can mean simply plurality, the condition of there being more than one. So if there is more than one kind of soda pop in the vending machine, that's a condition of plurality. We'd say there's a pluralism of soda pops. We wouldn't normally say that, of course. We reserve this term for other things. And particularly relevant to our situation here is that pluralism means the multiplying of religious and philosophical options in the Canadian social landscape. Canada has always been somewhat pluralized. There's always been more than one kind of native religious tradition in the tribal traditions coast to coast. There have been different kinds of Christianity in Canada. Judaism has an early start in Canada. As we brought workers from the Far East to work on the railroads, we brought workers from Europe. Canada has pluralized. But in the last really 50 years, particularly with the deliberate change of our immigration policy in the 60s and 70s, pluralism of religious and philosophical options has increased dramatically. And Canada is increasingly diverse from coast to coast, as we're experiencing here in Moncton as well. So, lots of options. That's just a description of the situation. Is there more than one? Then you have pluralism. Pluralism, secondly, can denote a preference for plurality. If you're pluralist, in this sense, you like there to be more than one. I myself am an ice cream pluralist. Normally, of course, as a Christian, I prefer chocolate, but every once in a while, I'm willing to walk on the wild side and maybe order a butter pecan or something equally worldly. Pluralism here would be a preference for there to be the situation of more than one. Most Canadians would be economic pluralists. We prefer a free market of competing businesses, competing institutions. We think that that's likely, as descendants of Adam Smith, that's likely the way we're going to get the best economic outcomes. And we don't necessarily believe in completely untrammeled or ungoverned free markets. In fact, most of us don't think that either. But in that sense, we don't believe and we don't think it's good to have monopolies, which is not what pluralism would be in the economic sense. And for many people, they prefer there to be a pluralism of philosophical and religious options as well, because they fear what happens when there's only one option. They fear totalitarianism. They fear hegemony. And as a Christian who has dabbled in Christian history, I would count myself one of those, because when we have been able to run the show, we have not always done a very good job. When we Christians got to dominate Tsarist Russia, when we Christians got to dominate the American South, when we Christians got to dominate Puritan England and Puritan New England, some pretty checkered history there when we got things our way. And that includes 1850 to 1950, when we more or less ran Canada too. Some very good things about that, some very not so good things about that as well. And so in the providence of God, I look forward to the day when Jesus will come back and he alone will rule. But until then, I like the idea of checks and balances. I like the idea of Her Majesty's loyal opposition, keeping the government in check. I'm a political pluralist in that sense. And thirdly, and this is often the way the one slides into the other, and this we have to be careful of, is pluralism as relativism. Now, the form of pluralism as relativism that is most common isn't actually pluralist. This would be so-called pluralism that says all the religions are good, or at least all the good religions are good. Right? That's often termed in theological circles religious pluralism, a sense that all the good religions are good. But in fact, that isn't true pluralism. The only way you can confidently and coherently claim that all the good religions are good is if you have a prior definition of goodness by which you evaluate the various religions and pronounce them good. But that's not pluralist. That's a single definition of good that you are now using to evaluate everybody else. You see? Even though it's marketed as such, it really isn't. And when critics of pluralists such as John Hick, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, and others, when they've made that point, they then retreat to something even vaguer to try to avoid that charge. But in fact, they haven't yet been able to do so. So all religions are good really isn't pluralist. There's a kind of implicit super religion that's judging all the rest. See the problem? It's not really pluralistic. Not sure what real pluralism would look like in that context, but this isn't it. There are a couple of actual pluralisms here. One is a nihilism generally in philosophy, and more particularly the example of naturalism. Nihilism is the idea that, or the conviction that there is no values present in the universe. There are no values present in the universe. Nihil coming from the Latin for nothing. So nihilism would be the idea that the universe is just matter and energy whirling about. And so in that sense, there's no way to judge between one value system or another. So they're all equally good or bad because they all amount to zero. So that's a kind of pluralism. And in fact, even though there aren't that many people who would call themselves nihilists, there are lots of people who are in fact scientific naturalists, who would follow Richard Dawkins and the new atheist Four Horsemen into, I would think, philosophical obscurity, because with that point of view, with the idea that evolution is the dominant, perhaps the only way to understand even human society, there are no values. There is simply struggle and winners and losers, but not better or worse. So that's true pluralism of a particularly bleak sort. The other form would be epistemological pluralism based on a kind of postmodern skepticism. And if we understand postmodernity correctly, and many, many people who stand in the position I'm in right now don't, but confidently talk about it anyway, but I'm going to try to help you with this. The postmodern situation is one of pervasive doubt. The postmodern situation is one in which we have heard all the big stories of modernity, and we've come to believe that everybody was up to something when they tried to sell us one of those stories. Could have been Christianity, could have been communism, could have been capitalism, could have been nationalism. But you know what? At the end of the day, some powerful people were using those stories to oppress the rest of us. And on the postmodern side of that, we don't ever, we're not going to be suckered again. You're not going to sell us another big story that's going to help some people dominate other people. And that's the fundamental reaction of the postmodern situation. Somebody comes to your door, knock, knock, knock. Hello, I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. I doubt it. I doubt it. So in a more advanced form, which I think is now abroad in the land, see, postmodernity and postmodernism was chic to talk about 30 years ago, maybe 40. And then about 20 years ago, everybody talked about it, and 10 years ago, we all got sick of it. And we got sick of it too fast, because now it's really here. It's not cool in the university. Now, as I'll suggest a little later in my talk, now it's everywhere. This doubt that anybody can be counted on to tell the truth. Not even scientists anymore. Right? Not even the white-coated priests of reason can be counted on anymore. We go to court, I'm from Monsanto, you're from Greenpeace, I'll bring my PhDs, you bring yours. That's where we are now. It's actually come home to roost. It's much worse than we thought it would be 20 years ago, because now it's everywhere. So pluralism takes different forms, and we can feel differently about it. So when we talk this afternoon, I'm going to talk about the first one. Oh boy, are there ever lots of options. And we'll talk about the pervasive sense of pluralism, particularly in the last 2 bullet points that are abroad in the land as well. I want to talk with you briefly, and in the book I'm going to show at the end that Cody referred to, Humble Apologetics, I talk about this at greater length. So I'll skate through this fairly quickly because you can get hold of the book and read it if you like. But I want to suggest that before we talk about how to respond to pluralism, we need to get it into greater focus. And I want to list for you what I think is a pretty handy little list of obstacles to proclaiming the gospel in Canada today. Here's the number one reason. And I've spoken about these subjects now for a couple of decades. As you can tell, I'm extremely old. And I've talked about this for quite a while. And I won't do it today because I don't need to. Because I used to ask groups, what's the number one reason why people resist hearing from their fellow Canadians about the gospel? And I would always get keen people like yourselves giving me answers. And they were always excellent answers, and they were never the right ones. Never. I never got the right answer in 20 years of lecturing on this. And it's the same answer in the US, and it's the same answer down under, and the Americans and the Aussies didn't do any better. So I won't put you on the spot today. I'm going to tell you. The main reason why Canadians don't want to hear you and me talk to them about the gospel is they think they know it already. 60% of Canadians, actually a little more than that, in the last census, the 2011 National Household Survey, said they're Christians already. They don't need you to tell them about it. 2/3 of the population, a little less than that, 2/3 of the population think they're Christians already. 25% more claim to have no religion. And the religion they don't have is Christianity. Now, I'm making an important sociological point. There are very few ex-Muslims in Canada, very few ex-Buddhists, very few ex-communists, very few ex-anything. What they aren't is Christian. Now you'll notice, because you're sharp people, you can add those two numbers together. I've just defined 85+% of the Canadian population. We're almost at 90. If you add all, coast to coast, all of the Muslims, all the Hindus, all the Buddhists, all the Sikhs, all the Jains, all the Shintoists, all the Confucianists, all the Taoists, all the self-identified atheists, all the Jews, you put them all together, you have less than 15% of the Canadian population. Islam's the second biggest religion in Canada today. Big deal. It's tiny compared to Christians. Ex-Christians, sort of Christians, don't want to be Christians. That's still the Canadian reality. Those other religions get over-reported, I think, for a couple of common sense reasons. Number one, most immigrants move to large urban centers, and that's where the media are. And the media want to tell us something new. What they don't want to say is, you know what? There's still quite a number of Presbyterians in Canada. Who cares? I mean, no offense to Presbyterians, love you, God loves you too, but that's not interesting. Most Canadians think they know it already, but here's the other shoe dropping. Most Canadians don't know it already. Right? It's a double problem. Most Canadians think they already understand Christianity either because they are Christian, they think, or because they aren't Christian on purpose. But in fact, church attendance, regular church attendance in Canada is now about 2 in 10. In 1946, it was better than 2 in 3. At the end of the Second World War, Canada had some of the highest church attendance in the world. Now, to be sure, Poland and Ireland were up to around 90%. But in Protestant countries, Canada was among the most church countries in the world for a good almost 100 years. Right around 2/3 of the population. In Quebec, close to 90. But in English-speaking Canada, close to 60. almost 2 out of 3 Canadians were going to church every week just a generation ago. If you're an older person and you think Canada has changed a lot since you were a kid, that's not nostalgia, that's true. We have been racing the Dutch for the fastest secularization since the French Revolution. 20% church attendance, and when it comes to polling Canadians on the basic truths of the Christian gospel, they're, depending on your point of view, hilarious or terrible. But you would think that if I asked you, let's set up a polling table downtown Moncton, let's take the next 10 people who come by, and we'll ask them to name the 10 commandments. We're not going to ask them whether they keep them, just whether they can name them. Bonus points for getting them in order. Or name the first 5 books of the Bible. Or the Beatitudes. Or, I'm a doctrine teacher. When I teach Christianity at the most basic level, right? Religion 101, world religions, I come to the Christianity part. I can't teach it without talking about at least these 3 things. Trinity, incarnation, atonement, right? You can't talk about Christianity without Trinity, incarnation, and atonement, right? How many Canadians could give a theologically correct definition of those 3 terms? How many pastors could? That's the situation we're in. Canadians think they know about Christianity and they demonstrably don't. And that's not like any other religion in the country, right? It really is part of the special situation of being downstream of Christendom in Canada. So that right there, it's pretty heavy set of obstacles. But let me make it worse. Many Canadians know about Christianity, most of us do, and they link it with something bad. You can make your own list. Aboriginal residential schools, and before we were worried about that, some of us remember Mount Cashel, right? Before we were in the soup for abusing Native kids, we were abusing our own kids. Lots of abusive situations, other sexual scandals in the media, and everybody's got them now. Catholic, Protestant, you name it. People have been up to stuff that they shouldn't be. But when most of the population has been identified with Christianity, as recently as 1991, upwards of 80% of Canadians called themselves Christians. I mean, that's only 20-some years ago. Most of what was bad that happened in Canada was ipso facto being done by people who called themselves Christians. When 90% of the population is calling themselves Christians, it's not the other 10% doing all the bad things. You might like to think so, but of course that's not true. And so there's sexual and other abuse that is being endured coast to coast, and it was from my pastor, and it was from my youth leader, and it was from my parents who were pillars of their churches and wore Christian t-shirts in the summer, and they're the ones. And when I go on Canadian talk shows, that's what I hear. It's not just about the high-profile cases, it's my case, which, again, statistically, we would predict would be true. If most people are calling themselves Christians in Canada, then most of what's bad is being done by people calling themselves Christians. What makes this even worse is the baby boom reaction against mom and dad, against the old ways of doing things, against the old regime, against l'ancien régime in Quebec. Because we are downstream of the quiet revolution in Quebec and what I call the even quieter revolution in the rest of Canada. But it's a revolution. And the baby boomers, who are just a little older than I am, have spent their entire lives not being mom and dad. It's like they never got out of adolescence as a generation. They've constantly been in reaction, which means their reaction against what was one of the dominant cultural facts of their parents' generation, being Christians. So they're not. I enjoy teaching some of their kids at the University of Manitoba who were driving their parents crazy because they decided they had to be not like their parents, so they were becoming conservative Jews or conservative Christians, just to stick it to mom and dad, right? Because they couldn't go any further left than their parents, so they were swinging right. Now they had to buy separate dishes for kosher, and they had to buy, it was really great. I said, good for you, that's great. My kids, of course, were kept in cells, and so they couldn't do that, but had that problem, but in open families, I guess that was done. And most Canadians link Christianity with being anti-science and technology. In fact, even being against reason in general, right? That's still a trope, that there's a warfare between Christianity and science. But here, let me bring you some news from the West Coast, where I spent part of my life in the last 20 years. See, on the West Coast, we get it in the neck from the other direction. What's wrong with Christianity is that it's responsible for science and technology. It provides the religious rationale for the exploitation of the earth. This goes back to 1967 with an article by the University of California, Berkeley's president or chancellor, I guess at the time, Lynn White, who says the whole doctrine of creation and the putting human beings in charge is the seed of Western rapacity. That gives you the rationalization for exploiting the earth. When I had my lunch, what I did about 10 years ago, I was speaking at the same conference as David Suzuki, and we happened to have the same agent, and I thought, let's see if we can work out. And I had my lunch with David. I've written about this a couple times. It was a lot of fun. And we both University of Chicago people, so we chatted a little bit about that. And then he went on. He probably talked for the first hour, and that was great because I wanted to hear what he had to say. And this is what he said. Christianity is basically responsible for the ethos that justifies ecological degradation. And he said, don't talk to me about stewardship and all that stuff. He said, I know it's just another kinder, gentler way of talking about how human beings are still in charge. We shouldn't be in charge. Everybody should just be at the same level. No species above any other. And when he finished, I said, well, actually, I find that really comforting because you've just given me permission not to care about the rest of the globe. That's pretty much how the way wolves feel about rabbits. Just one species among others. I just happen to have bigger teeth than you. Run, little one, run. I said, Christianity actually says we are responsible for creation. We're the only creatures that are supposed to care for creation, and we're supposed to care about creation. But if I listen to you, then I don't have to care about anything except my next meal. The only time in the conversation David was quiet. And it went on so long it was awkward, and I shifted the conversation to baseball because it was just I didn't want to. And over the next 20 minutes, we started talking about Christian ecological groups. And by the time we were done, we had exchanged information about the David Suzuki Foundation and La Rocha in Vancouver, and a month later, they started to work together. And that's my little tiny contribution to trying to connect those two very different worlds that shouldn't have been so far apart. But they were because of this misunderstanding of the doctrine of creation and what that meant for us. So we're getting it from both sides, right? Christianity is bad because it's anti-science and technology, and also because it's responsible for science and technology. More obstacles. Many Canadians think proselytizing is bad. It's just bad. It's un-Canadian, right? You're trying to shove your religion down my throat, right? You're trying to impose your beliefs on others. We all know about these sorts of things. And it's an inconsistent view because we don't think all advertising is bad, and we don't think all political messaging is bad, and we don't think all academic argument is bad. We don't think all social media interaction is bad. Now, we can all think of bad versions of all those, but we don't seem to think in any other sphere of life it's a bad thing to argue about what's best. Unfortunately, so much proselytizing really is bad. So much of how Canadian Christians have approached our neighbors has been pretty bad. So we do have to proceed sensitively to the idea that pressing your views in this zone is somehow especially bad. And there's actually a whole set of reasons why Canadians are nervous about that, properly nervous about that. It pretty much goes back to Confederation, but that's another lecture for another time. What else do we face? In the light of these social facts, what's particularly interesting, and if I get a chance to revise Humble Apologetics, I'm going to have to add a couple of pages to its introduction, because that's about as far as I got with that edition. But over the last 10 years or so, things have changed again. This is what I mean about postmodernity coming home, but it's actually worse than that. It's what I call the new moralism. And when I say it's worse than that, it's actually postmodernity. And you're not going to thank me for this, I know. I wish there was a more elegant term, but this is what I'm talking about. And I can only talk about this very briefly. I've got a whole lecture on this too, but let's do it in a minute or two instead and try to keep to our time. You see, modernity dispatched traditional authorities. Modernity pretty much did away with believing the priest just because he said so. Right? It pretty much did away with the Bible says, and that's it. So it did away with traditional authorities. Now, if you want to justify your claims to truth, you generally have to do it on the basis of experience and reason, some combination of those, varieties of those. Now, you might also, as a Christian modern person, believe in the revelation of God through Scripture and so on, but you had to kind of work to square that with the dominant paradigms of modernity, namely that experience and reason together in different modes, could be romantic, could be enlightenment, were the sources of truth. Just traditional authorities were no longer to be believed just because they held those positions. But postmodernity comes along and dispatches the modern authorities. So now we don't trust the scientists either. So what's left? And this is why we have to go to postmodernity, because you can't live in a state of constant doubt. Right? You can't raise your kids that way. You can't really even drive confidently down the street if you think people may or may not obey the rules of the road. So we can't, in fact, inhabit a state of constant doubt. So what is now the case? It seems to me there are lots of cultural signs, which I don't have time to list for you now, but what's left is simply what's left, namely intuition. Not because it actually remains unscathed by modernity and postmodernity, but simply because we need something on which to decide our lives. And so I guess I'll just do what seems right to me, which is really what intuition basically is. It's what appears clearly to me to be the case. And this has given rise to what I'm calling the new moralism. See, preachers and professors on these kinds of subjects have for some time been saying something that we should stop saying. We've been saying, because we've gotten used to saying, out of the flower power, hippie culture, post-1968 situation in the West, that the culture is you do your thing, I do my thing, cultural relativism is everywhere, let 1,000 flowers bloom. That ship has sailed. That's gone with the wind. You know what I hear nowadays? We're right, you're wrong, go to hell. That's what I hear now. We're right about the environment, you're wrong, get with it or get out. We're right about LGBTQ, you're right, you're wrong, get out. And if you show up on campus, we'll outshout you until you have to shut up. That's what we're facing now. See, it's not just bad-tempered people, it's not just the trolls. Lots of otherwise decent people are thinking this way now. It's what seems intuitively obvious is what's right. Because what else do they have to steer by? What else do they have to steer by now? Two crucial problems then. When we try to share the faith with others, we have the problem of plausibility. Most apologetical efforts at conferences like, not this particular one, but apologetic conferences and books are aimed at this good question, is it true? This is the problem, credibility. What are the reasons to think that these claims are true? But the prior question has to be asked and answered or you never get there. See, what I'm trying to figure out is why do so few people that I know want to listen to my 7 shiny arguments for Christianity? I've worked hard to come up with these 7 really excellent issues, but I never have anybody say to me, you know, John, you're a PhD in religion. Let's sit down and have you take the next 3 hours to give me a convincing case for Christianity. Like, no one's ever done that in my entire life. fact, I've had people try to avoid that happening. Why? Because of the prior problem of plausibility, which gets at might it be true. See, because of all the things I've talked about over the last half hour, most Canadians won't let you get started because they already have ruled it out. It's not in the universe of live options. We've been there, we've done that, we're done. Now, Buddhism, that's interesting, don't know much about that, tell me about that. Or, that's an interesting kind of philosophy you've got there. Eckhart Tolle, oh, that's kind of interesting, I don't know anything about that. But Christianity, well, that I know, and we're done with that. That means we don't even get started. That's the problem of plausibility. I don't want to hear one shiny argument, let alone 7. But that's connected with a second crucial problem, what I call the problem of complacency. About every 18 months, when I was teaching at Regent College, a Christian graduate school in Vancouver, about every 18 months, somebody who'd read something of mine on apologetics or evangelism or something would take a meeting with me, and they all went the same way. And I kept doing it because I love these young people, but there would be somebody who was coming to Vancouver to plant a church. You know, they almost never wanted to plant it in Red Deer or Medicine Hat or Thompson. They wanted to come to Vancouver because they had just such a burden for this, you know, gorgeous city that they'd seen on the Olympics. You know, so one after the other, every 18 months, some young church planter would take a meeting with me, and they talk about going down to some of the posh parts of Vancouver, Cole Harbour, or down into Yaletown, the big towers and the beautiful people. And I said, you might as well try to plant a garden on concrete. You know, if you really want to plant a church in Vancouver, go to the downtown east side. There's lots of people who'd like your help there. They never wanted to go to the downtown east side. They always wanted to go to the shiny places. And they're shiny because they're hard, because nobody there thinks he or she needs what you're offering. They're living the good life. If I'm able to afford a condo in Yaletown or Cole Harbour, and I can go out on my inline skates and grab a latte on the way and then pick up the ingredients for a clever little salad on the way home, like, I'm not interested in a life-changing spiritual conversation. My life is groovy right now. Now that's simply a kind of exaggerated case of the way most Canadians have. We haven't fought a major war in a couple of generations now. We've been fighting wars, and people have been dying, but most Canadians don't know that. Like, most Canadians don't feel that unless you happen to be in a forces family. 2008, our conservative bank system protected us in some ways from that. There's lots of things to criticize about it, but there's lots of things to be grateful for as well. We really haven't had any reason for quite a long time to do anything other than focus on ourselves and focus on our families. And get a little bit richer and a little bit better, and if our wages aren't going up, then we focus on that, because they jolly well should. And so there's been this complacency. Most Canadians don't feel much of a need to change because things are working out fairly well. And where they aren't is economically, so that's where we look, is for economic help. Why bother? What do we want for our friends and neighbors? We want them to become disciples of Jesus Christ. We don't want to convert them to the Christian religion, because that's not going to save them. We don't want to simply get them to concede the argument, fun as that is. I've won a few arguments in my day, always very satisfying. Have a little book I read. No, I don't actually. I couldn't care less. But it's not what I'm doing it for. We aim to remove obstacles to the gospel, to clarify the gospel, and to commend the gospel. Right? That's what we're trying to do. When we're engaged in these conversations, our objective is not to win the argument. Our objective is to win the friend, to draw that friend closer to Jesus Christ. And this is important to reinforce, because many Canadians are feeling defensive in Canada right now, and the temptation is to defend yourself rather than love your neighbor. I'm more worried about this than I was 10 years ago. Right? we're more worried about defending our rights and privileges, we're losing our focus. Our focus has to be giving gifts to our neighbors, not protecting what we still got while we still have enough power to keep it. Like, that's not our point, right? Right? So we want to connect our friends and the gospel. And in an increasingly pluralized Canada, that means ascertaining their fundamental concern in each case. I've talked pretty globally about large-scale Canadian trends, but among those trends are the fact that Canada's diversifying, it's pluralizing. So when I have a particular friend, I need to find out what that particular friend is concerned about. In design thinking, we talk about something from the Toyota Motor Company, and they give us the 5 whys. I'm concerned about this. My friend is upset, he says, about who was Cain's wife. That really bothers him. Or what about creation and evolution? That bothers this other person. Or what about the way Christians treat women? And what Toyota teaches you to do is say, now, why are you concerned about that? Well, because I feel that Christians shouldn't treat women differently than men. Well, why do you feel that way? Well, because it seems to me to be wrong to treat people in a sexist way. Well, why do you think that? And you're not trying to be a pain. You're trying to bore down to what the real issue is. Because nobody actually does care who Cain's wife was. And not that many people are lying awake at night trying to square creation and evolution. Right? Not that many people. A few apologetics keeners are, but most people aren't really worried too much about that. What are you concerned about? And when you think you may have gotten to a real question, depending on the relationship, you might ask simply this. Now, that's a really good question. If I were to answer that question to your satisfaction, would you then be prepared to become a Christian? Rarely is the answer, by golly, I would. But if that's the problem, why isn't that the consequence? Because maybe it's not the problem. So it's worth trying to ascertain what's really going on. And you can only do that by asking questions, listening hard, and asking some more. And a lot of us interested in apologetics aren't very good at asking questions and listening. We like to talk. We're full of answers. And we just want to explode with answers over everybody. And we can't do that, especially in a pluralized Canada. When you don't know what you've got till you figure it out. Who is this person in front of me? What is she really concerned about? You have to find out. You can't assume. Do you believe in God? Yes, I do. Well, then let me know. No, you have no idea what she just said. She used the 3-letter cipher, G-O-D. In Canada in 2019, you have no idea what that means until you ask. If we're going to connect friends in the gospel, secondly, we want to focus on Jesus as quickly as possible, since, of course, Jesus is key. If you don't have to talk about creation versus evolution, don't talk about it, right? No one's going to be saved by having correct views of Genesis, right? I mean, you do think that, right? Because I've had a few of my Christian friends that I think they're not quite sure about that. Well, I don't know, it's pretty important. It's not that important. Right? Focus on Jesus, not too quickly, because Jesus needs very careful introduction nowadays. One of the, I think, really helpful emphases from the work of the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, borrowing from a longer tradition of New Testament scholarship going back to Ed Sanders. But what this scholarship reminds us, Christians, is that there's a whole big Old Testament before there's a new one. And to really understand what Jesus is doing, you can't start with Matthew. You need the background for Jesus' story to make sense. In fact, in sociological terms, the gospel needs a plausibility structure, as Peter Berger says. It needs a governing intellectual framework within which the story of Jesus makes sense. Now, I tried to do that last night. I tried to show you that the claims about Jesus, if you have the appropriate backstory, then make sense. It's no longer arbitrary that Christians say what they say about Jesus once you know the backstory, which I did in terms of problem and solution. Historically, we do it in terms of the Christian story. creation, fall, redemption, and what God does with Israel to set up what he does in Jesus. Without that, we don't connect. Let me give you a couple more suggestions and then we'll keep to our time because we want to make sure we do. You've listened long and hard today. Let me give you a couple more suggestions. Read the Bible and read it with your friend. This used to be something we all did. Remember old people? Remember when we used to have Bibles like with us and we would actually open them with people we were trying to share the gospel with? Well, the young people have a great advantage now because they have their phones. Whip it out, Bible's right there, if you know where to get. Read the Bible with them so that it's not just your account of Christianity that they're encountering, it's the Word of God. And we want to offer them not just our opinion or the Christian religion, we want to offer them God's Word. But see, it's not enough to have it on your phone, you got to know where to go. Just a second now, I'm pretty sure there's a verse in here. Deuteronomy, no. Let's see. No, right? 4 hours later, Philippians. Yeah, there it is, right? That won't do. You've long since lost the conversation and your friendship, right? You have to know it so you can share it. And so one of the basic skills we need to be teaching in our churches is where do you go in the Bible to offer somebody scripture about the gospel? I remember learning that in Bible school. I remember learning it in my church. I don't know who does that now, but we should be, because otherwise, it's just your opinion. And secondly, and I'm going to conclude with this and then show you a graphic at the end, invite them to Christian community. So again, it's not just your account. You actually bring them into Christian community. And also, it's what I call, borrowing from Berger, the idea of plausibility structures, my term is plausibility places. This is where these are social contexts in which the Christian gospel begins to seem plausible. Right? Canadians are pretty sure it's not worth it, but if they come to a Christian dinner party and they find that everybody there is actually fairly attractive and not a kook, and not an obvious racist, sexist nightmare, or if they come to hang out with a Christian family and they find the parents actually treat the kids pretty well and the kids are reasonably respectful to their parents and they actually seem to love each other, that's interesting. You have no idea how powerful a functional family can be in the Canadian landscape today. I didn't know people could be like this. Churches, families, small groups, Christian social, these are the places, the plausibility places that's the Christian gospel to, well, maybe it's worth, it seems like pretty crazy thing these people believe, but they seem not to be crazy. So does your church qualify as one? Is it the kind of place that is so healthy that people would come in and say, whatever they've got going, I want some of that? See, if church for most Canadians is what I think it is, it's a show on Sunday that we attend, and we have no more relationship with the people in the pew than we do the people with whom we have season's tickets to the hockey game. Oh, nice to see you again. Yeah, it's going to be a great game tonight. Game. That was great. Yeah, it was. See you next time, right? If that's what we have to offer the world, that better be a really good show. And it's really hard for church to compete with showbiz in 2019. We better be offering something else. Because I want to hear what Richard has to say about exactly these things. See what we did there? See that? Years of practice. But I'll refer you to the book that I was suggesting and that Cody's mentioned, and some contact information if you'd like to get in touch with me, because there's lots more to say than we can say. Twitter that's my handle there. My email address, write to me there. I write once a week on Canadian public affairs from a Christian point of view. For Canada's show Context with Lorna Duick. Some of you will be interested to know that show actually, when they asked me to write for it, I thought that's a nice little Christian show from Crossroads. I was a little bit snobbish about it. We actually outdraw Peter Mansbridge's show on Sunday morning. It's interesting. So it's not nothing. It's not great, but it's not nothing. And that's the book that you can easily find, which will help you with some more suggestions. You can see that I front-loaded my talk today, though, where I think we need to start, which is what are we up against? Because unless we get that in focus, all the good solutions I can offer you kind of go by. But now that we see what we're up against, the rest of that book is trying to offer you some solutions. Rich is going to give us some more, and then we got time for a little break before 4 o'clock, right? Do we? Okay. Thanks very much for your attention.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Stackhouse. Very much appreciated. So, I just want to remind everyone that while there is no formal Q&A section at the end of each lecture, you are more than welcome to approach the speakers one-on-one if you want to talk to them personally, or if you would like to have a question possibly show up in our Q&A panel at the end of today, addressed to any or all of the speakers. You can do so if you're in person. You can fill out a question and put it in our mailbox right outside the door of the room here. If you are tuned in online and would like to submit a question for the Q&A panel, you can do so by writing it in the comments section of the live stream or sending a message to the Faith Seeking Understanding Symposium Facebook page. Now, if you have not already, again, I'm going to encourage you to go and sign up for the monthly electronic newsletter for Ratio Christi at Cranbrook University. It's how you can keep up to date with what we're doing on campus, including special events like this. And if you sign up for the newsletter this weekend, you'll be entered for a free draw for the Apologetics Study Bible. We have a copy to give away, so feel free to sign up for our newsletter and then be entered into the draw for that. There's also a canteen out there, and the proceeds go towards the Bachelor of Theology students' mission trip to Cuba. And they are also doing a draw that you can buy tickets for to be entered for a chance to win a $50 gift card to Chapters. So we are going to join together again at 4:15 p.m. Atlantic time for those of you tuned in online to hear Reverend Dr. Richard Jackson once again come up and share with us. He gave the introduction at the symposium yesterday, and today he will be giving the closing lecture for this year's Faith Seeking Understanding Symposium about how in the midst of our pluralistic culture, kind of zooming in even further on what Dr. Stackhouse just spoke to, how we as local churches, as local bodies of believers, can be a welcoming congregation to people from different cultural and religious backgrounds. So we look forward to that. We'll see you all in a short while at 4:15 p.m. Atlantic time. So thank you.